Hi, T. Falcon Neighbor. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. Today we're going to continue our discussion about the 7 core emotions. We last time talked about anger. We got a few little points left to cover on anger, which brings me to hand things over to Brian. So Brian, tell everybody what it is you discovered and what you discovered in your discovery.
Yeah, I was looking for the underlying factors of anger because on all of these emotions that are on that list that we've been talking about, they're all different in terms of what triggers the response or the emotion experience, and then the neural pathways and systems that are involved in it, which means that it's going to elicit a different neurochemical. So we can't look at this in terms of emotions as all the same. They're all uniquely different. And that's the difficulty of studying what we call emotion. So neuroscientists tend to like to look at what parts of the brain are initiated, are ignited in when a person's experiencing. That's what that research that I sent you is showing, that there's different parts of the brain when it comes to anger.
Yeah. Well, and as I was looking over this, one question that came up for me was, is it possible for a human to experience 2 different emotions simultaneously?
It is possible, but they're not aware of it, because it's just like when we're talking about emotional intelligence, the key factor is about awareness, right? So a lot of times, even think about something like fear. Your body is picking up that you're in danger's way. You become aware of it when, like, say, for instance, you're standing in the middle of the road and you don't see, because the peripheral vision might be limited. So you don't see the truck coming on, but when you hear the roar of the engine or the loud horn, now you're aware of it, right? So that was already present. So the closer things become, the more, and this is a attention management perspective, the things that are closer are going to get our attention, whereas things that are further away, not so much. And it's the same thing when we're processing any of these emotions. So they can be aware, they can be experiencing them, because remember, when we're talking about the neurotransmitters, some of them have that hormonal effect, and a hormone by design means that it could be originated in different parts of the body, but it can ignite other parts of the body. That's what makes it a hormone.
And so to my question about multiple emotions being experienced simultaneously, are they really happening coincidentally, or are they just happening in rapid and random succession?
In random succession, because remember, the first order of the brain, in terms of the nervous system, is to preserve and conserve energy. So there's always this kind of competition for resourcefulness and energy. And that's what that idea of that Dr. Ledoux in his book, The Emotional Brain, he talks about emotion response, emotion feelings, and how we go along and vacillate between the two in terms of this continuum.
Interesting. Well, I bring it up because the next emotion I want to be exploring is grief. And the thing we taught about anger was that anger and pain walk hand in hand. Well, grief certainly has a pain element to it as well. So the loss of a loved one. I mean, you can feel grief over the loss of anything you really cared about, but nevertheless, loss of a loved one seems to be the one that comes up as the hallmark example of grief. So, and I know that at a certain stage of coping or adjusting to death and dying, anger is a natural stage that someone goes through. So I've just was looking at this going like, well, does that mean that anger and grief can be experienced simultaneously? Or at some point during your grieving process, you're going to become angry? And then you'll get past that anger, but the grief will continue. So thoughts about that, anybody? You're all welcome to unmute. Hi, everybody.
Yeah,
Hi, Dragan here. I think grief is already a sort of experiencing pain.
Yes.
So
exactly.
anger will be there. Anger will be there for sure.
Yeah.
Exactly.
because I'm angry that, so and so is gone, or I'm angry that the universe took them, or I'm angry about, and I can certainly see how all the little details of the practical side of someone passing away, that you're just on edge, just waiting to basically lash out at somebody. But I was
Yeah.
just thinking that when I'm experiencing the true emotion of grief, that feels very different to me than the true emotion of anger.
Right. So there's different expressions of it because
Hmm.
most people on the call don't know, that I went through that because I never talked about my wife and daughter were killed in a car accident,
Oh,
right?
I didn't know that. That's
Exactly,
terrible.
because I never talked about it, but it took 5 years literally to, I won't say get back to normal, but
Yeah,
to get to a point where, because I reached a point where I got tired of crying. Like I said, I just don't have any more tears left.
yeah, yeah.
And that guilt of that made me angry.
Hmm.
So these are different kinds of expressions again. So it's not an emotion because we don't have a center in the brain, one area that just simply process emotions. It's emotions, the experience of it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, because
Yeah,
even in what you've just described, there was definitely plenty of grief, occasional anger, but I even just heard elements of shame, that you felt
exactly.
guilty for running out of tears.
Yeah, because people will say, yeah, you got to get back out there, you have to do that. And,
Yeah, yeah.
I was sharing with Boris when I talked with him that, I recently sold my home 2 years ago in San Diego because it reminded me of my wife and daughter.
Yeah.
So, I was still connection. And during the holidays, become quite difficult because that was the favorite season. So, all
Hmm.
these things kind of trigger and it brings this stuff back up.
Yeah.
Although it's been some time now.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I'd be very curious to understand a little bit more about the neurochemistry, because I can certainly think that within a very, very small number of seconds, you could easily go from feeling the grief to feeling the anger to feeling the shame and back to anger and back to grief, and just bouncing from one to another. But to me, these each feel like very separate and distinct experiences, emotional experiences. And that would
Yeah.
seem to indicate that the brain soup, the neurochemical soup that you're experiencing, is changing as well.
Yeah, I talk about this idea that I'm going to write about some point. When I was introduced to emotional response, emotional feelings, and this kind of idea how we vacillate between them, I talk about the idea of emotional contagion, emotional neutrality, emotional regulation. All of these equates to some kind of emotional acuity.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, in other words, emotional contagion, people can be obsessed with and addicted to the drama of emotions, and that becomes their
Hmm.
kind of default mode. So, like your friend that you
Oh
described,
yeah, yeah.
that
Hmm.
that's IED situation. So it's an intermittent emotional disorder. That's a real diagnosis that will require some SSRIs.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, no, you've just described exactly. We've often said that we know plenty of people who are addicted to negativity, or addicted to bad news, or addicted to whatever helps them to feel alive. And I think it's sad if the only thing that makes you feel alive is grief, or the only thing
Right.
that makes you feel alive is anger. But we all know plenty of people who are stuck emotionally. And it's not surprising that at a certain point in time, your brain has to recognize that it has run out of true content to support whatever the emotional state is that you're experiencing. But because you insist on lingering in that emotional state, your brain has no choice but to creatively come up with some sort of content to support whatever it is you're experiencing or want to be experiencing.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I've always
That's where they
said,
would lack that emotional regulation because
right,
that, yeah, so they can't regulate it. And that's what the emotional intelligence is trying to get people to understand that, okay, you have a feeling, but that's it's a response to something that's going on environmentally. So what do
right,
you
right,
want to
right.
do with it?
Yep,
And that's where
exactly.
attention management becomes the most important part, because it encompasses and accounts for the full emotions experience, right? The
Yeah,
physical, the
yeah.
intellectual, and emotional.
Right, and now you're getting into what I want the real subject of the call to be. It's kind of like where does our role, I understand you're a physician, but our role as someone who is not a licensed medical care professional or mental health professional, where does our skill set and our need to hand off to someone with a different skill set begin? And so I've always thought like, well, if people are in sort of an emotional state and they want to explore those emotions in great detail and the history behind it and all that, that is not really my wheelhouse. But
Mm-hmm.
I know I'm going to hear about people's emotions, but I want to quickly get into what is it that you want to be different? How do you want, we got to get into changing things, um, as opposed to just spending hour upon hour talking about feelings.
If I
Right.
can just
That's what,
Yeah, go right ahead, Kathy. Go ahead.
just for a minute. I'm so sorry, Brian, to hear
no.
amazing what you've been able to do with that. I just wanted to comment about the basic Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief, just to, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Yes. So just to throw that in, however.
What is that called?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Kubler-Ross, a woman who studied grief and death and dying, and is very famously wrote, I'm sure you've heard of her, wrote a book about death and dying years ago in the 60s, 70s, 80s time frame. But she's been sort of the expert on grief, and she defines 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I think that those are concepts that certainly we could use with intention management in terms of helping people work through those stages.
Yeah, yeah. So, Brian, is that your first time hearing about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work on death and dying?
It is.
Oh, my friend, it has been around for a very long time. But her first book, I think, well, the book that made her popular was On Death and Dying. And her name's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she did come up with these 5 observable stages, or stages that she had observed people work through. And there's a lot in the book that talk about the speed with which someone advances through these different stages. There are certain times when people might backslide a little bit on the progression, but that ultimately people are predictably going to go through each of these stages. And so if someone goes from the first one, the denial, it's kind of like, oh, X couldn't possibly have happened. No, that can't be true, so it's like this immediate denial. And perhaps you can relate to this as you think about your coping with your situation with your wife and daughter. But the shock is met with denial. Well, that denial is then followed up by anger. And the anger could be directed in many different directions, or it could be triggered by many different things that are going on. You said they were in a traffic accident. I have to believe you became very angry with whoever and whatever else was involved in that traffic accident. Who knows who, right? So there was and anger, it's not like, and Kathy, you're welcome to chime in more details if you feel that Brian would benefit from this. Anger is not necessarily something you go through and 20 minutes later you're done with it. Exactly. So it could be a long one. Well, the anger is then followed by bargaining. And bargaining, Kathy, if you want to talk a little bit about it, I just remember bargaining is kind of like you want to kind of reach out to the universe and say, God, if you'll just do this, if I could just have blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, it's the beginning. It's almost the beginning. The pain is so great that it's the beginning of an awakening toward a shift from this of saying, yes, if I'll be good.
Right, if you'll just
if I'm good, if I stop my evil ways, or if I do this or I do that, can you please make it better? Can you either please bring them back or relieve this pain or do whatever? But it's a kind of universal sort of spiritual bargaining, and I suppose you can transpose it to other human beings, but that's kind of the process.
Well, and
So you're bargaining with yourself?
Well, I mean, ultimately, all this is happening in your own heart, in your own head.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in the content of those bargaining discussions, it's not at all unusual to find God gets pulled into it, or whatever their God concept happens to be, some greater power. And as Kathy pointed out, a lot of it is about, I'll do anything, just take this pain away. And that's it. But so you have to kind of think about bargaining as being like the first real step of the healing part of what's going on, because obviously the denial and the anger, that's all very fresh and tied to whatever the actual loss was all about. And by the way, although this was originally done about death and dying of other people, over time, this whole process has been generalized to apply to the loss of anyone or anything. So if you lose a big client, you can also go through the same five stages.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Boris.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, this also applies in the business context. Whenever you go through a crisis situation in the business, for example, companies that got hit by COVID really hard and clearly weren't expecting it, these 5 stages are just as applicable there.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right.
The loss of the startup.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bart.
Dragon.
Yeah, just a little thing. First, yes, exactly what you said. It's really about loss, utter deep loss. Then you go through this process. But the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are not necessarily 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They can interchange. You can switch from one to the other, but they can help you to sort of get a grip of where you are or where you should go to. But they can really go from one to the other.
Yep. Yeah. So, and by the way, if you really start to research Kubler-Ross's work, you'll find she's got plenty of critics who've come along, but she was trying to present a rather simple model for the consumer level. Just to help them cope, as opposed to putting together a methodology for professionals to use in a clinical sort of setting. I don't think that was not her intended audience at that point in time. But you're absolutely right. They can occur in different orders. They do kind of bounce around a little bit, but overall, if you can feel that the person is moved past most of their anger and now they're starting to get into the bargaining. The thing is that the bargaining is followed by depression, because the person who's in the midst of bargaining realizes that there's not really a bargain to be struck.
Yeah.
So, and then you go like, well, I'm exhausted now. And the exhaustion can be physical, emotional, intellectual. But I think you're depressed, not just sad, but I think at a physiological level, and no doubt at a neurochemical level, you're depressed.
Yeah.
And that one can linger.
Yeah.
So T, I have a question for Brian from a neurochemistry perspective. When you have somebody that goes through an experience, let's say it's a traumatic experience like this, where medications like SSRIs might be helpful to get them through the situation. I kind of get that. But what if somebody's somewhat addicted to a behavioral thing where they're addicted to the emotion, as we were talking about the anger example of the person that T was describing? Yeah. If you've got a person like that you're working with, wouldn't it make sense that the SSRI or pharmacological approach is not that great because it treats the symptom, not the cause, and the way to the cause is really getting them to get a new perspective?
Yes and no. I say yes because a lot of times, again, that the neurotransmitter soup is at hand. So there's a series of neurotransmitters that you can't account for just one. So what the SSRIs are attempting to do, and where they find research-wise it works best, is when they're reinforced with those kinds of behavioral changes that you're talking about. So it's not just an either or thing, it's a both and. And oftentimes people see the pharmaceutical commercial where, they're using all this contrapositive things where they're talking about all these, harmful side effects because it is an experiment, but they're using contrapositive things like the nice ice cream music and the person, walking or running in the fields with lilies. And so that's what people pick up on, thinking that, oh, if I just take the pill, that my issue will be resolved. But the pill is supposed to bring a sense of homeostasis.
Yeah.
But that has to be reinforced. And if you read, have any of you ever read, who wrote that book, Well Done? Was that a Ken Blanchard thing?
Well Done?
WHALE?
Well Done.
Right. He wrote a book, Well Done. It was based off of Disney's Institute's training. They teach some of these principles about how do you teach a 5-ton whale to do what it's supposed to do.
Right. Yeah.
So they
Ken
use
Blanchard,
a lot of positive reinforcement. Because remember, those systems in the midbrain, midbrain is called mammalian brain because they're very biological and evolutionary in terms of how it's developed. So they're very reactionary. Yeah. So these systems are the same thing as in all mammals, right? So we have to account for those things, but the key is to be aware of them, but then to unlearn becomes the key of what you're talking about, Boris. So you want to help them unlearn, then you're working with the root cause, but sometimes they need that trigger from an SSRI to even reach the point of homeostasis, particularly if they're so used to that and they've been doing it for X amount of years.
Yeah.
So you need both and.
Yeah, and let me also add to that these kind of chronic behaviors, long-term sorts of behaviors, do not occur in complete isolation for that individual. Right. There's a whole system around them that is allowing that behavior and perhaps even supporting that behavior.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, to fix it, there may very well need to be a lot of people involved, a coordinated effort, coordinated learning, because everyone is playing their role in whatever this dysfunctional psychodrama happens to be.
Exactly.
So I think I've always thought about that there's no such thing as a dysfunctional person as much as there is a dysfunction in the system that the person is part of. And so we have to be a little bit more systemic in that. So certainly that applies on the business side of things as well.
So to bring that back to tension management, we're working with somebody from a business context, and clearly we're not experts, let's say, in the medical side of the equation, unlike Brian. What's the best way to support that individual and not have to get into the weeds of pharmacological side of things?
Yeah, let me address that with a couple of things that I've done in the past. First of all, I will tell you that dysfunction thrives in darkness. So once you put a bright light on something, the whole process can actually, fixing can actually begin. And so there's no longer hiding this dysfunction in the shadows. In an organizational setting, we want the individual to acknowledge that X exists. And we want the people that are around that individual to also acknowledge that X exists. We want them to talk about what each of their roles are in allowing that, encouraging that, or supporting that to continue. So they understand this is a systemic thing. So we let them know, you guys have created this organism. And this organism is it's a dog that bites, and we need to make sure that we treat it as such. And so everyone needs to be living the truth openly, outwardly. So if you hear a person or see a person continue to manifest a behavior, don't stay quiet about it. Instead, say something about it, like you've just done it again, or you're doing it again, or whatever the case may be. Awareness is the first step on the road to recovery. Yep. And we need to make sure the person stays aware of what's going on.
Exactly.
In a business setting, that means that that person who has positional power over a lot of these people who are part of the psychodrama also has to say, I want you to do this. There will be no negative repercussions. And then we, as the outsider who's there facilitating this, and by the way, it might have started with a bit of an intervention. So, because something has to have triggered it to just say enough. And sometimes in a business setting, a lawsuit has arisen or threat of a lawsuit has arisen about a person's behavior. Well, now we can say there's good reason for us to be intervening. You've crossed a line. But
Right.
hopefully we can intervene before that.
Yeah.
So that's a few thoughts. Yeah.
In a business setting, I think there tends to be a disconnect between understanding that the environment itself plays a key role in behavior. All behavior serves an incentive.
Yes.
So again, like what's interesting about this conversation for me is like right now I'm doing a judge for a pitch contest. And so there's people that come from like the finance industry. And it's always been said that the finance industry operates on greed and fear. So they build these culture where there's high sales practices and these kinds of things, and they put people on that edge of risk. But then when they cross that line, they're trying to address a behavior that they created the conditions for.
Yes.
And so they're not dealing with anything, in terms of environmental conditions. They're trying to address the behavior logically. And the people are like, okay, well, we have these parameters that exist that allows us to go on. Now, all of a sudden, I'm just supposed to change. And they're disconnected from that. So the environment plays a key role in that. That's that part of unlearning and setting people up for success. Because again, dopamine just simply wants dopamine. It doesn't care if it's value driven or not.
It just wants it.
It just wants it.
Yeah.
So if you don't set up the conditions to allow them, that give them the feedback and allow them to understand how to learn, how to strategically think about the whole and connected parts, like your behavior is going to impact the whole organization. We can get sued. Then there's no reason for them to check anything as they go. Just like take an industry like healthcare industry, you have all these regulations, these rules, you have compliance officers that literally come and document and audit a physician's chart. And they're pretty powerful. Like they can question the physician, like, okay, why are you prescribing this as opposed to this?
Yeah. Let me address another thing that Boris brought up about what can you do, because number one, you can't just immediately give someone a pill and have it have any effect. But even before the discussion about pills comes along, what else can you be doing? And so let me share with you something that I've learned over the years from Diane Bufflin. Most of you guys know Diane. I wish she could be on the call, but she's just swamped with all kinds of things going on in her reality. At a certain point, I'd love for her to share the story, because the way that she is coping with the stressors that are arising in her life on many different levels is just a marvel to behold. And I'd love to understand why her bowl of neurochemical soup is so much more delicious than a lot of the soups the rest of us are being fed by our brain. That being said, Diane has her PhD in biochemical psychology. And so one of her core beliefs is that when someone comes in for talk therapy, that very often the content of that talk therapy is all being invented by their mind. And this goes back to what I was talking about. If the brain doesn't have real content to support whatever it's experiencing, it's very creative. It can certainly conjure up anything it feels like conjuring up. So Diane has always been of the belief that until we know that your chemistry is in balance, it may be too soon to be talking about issues. And I forget what her research actually showed, but her research showed that the vast majority of talk therapy issues vanished without further discussion the moment the person's chemistry was in balance. So I thought that was a very interesting insight. Now, just so you guys know a little bit about what she's done, I've probably shared with you what her doctoral thesis was all about. but it was all about studying the female prison population to find out what the relationship was between a woman being caught for committing a crime and what was going on with her hormones and neurochemistry and all this kind of stuff. And long story short, she basically found out that the vast majority of women who were caught in a crime were caught within X number of days of the onset of their menstrual cycle. So this is what she was trying to figure out. But what her research ultimately showed was not that a woman's neurochemistry is going to make her a criminal. No, all it does is makes her sloppy. And so she found out that it was this carelessness. It was this, they weren't their normal, well thought through criminal. And instead they just, for whatever reasons, neurochemically, things were not really supporting it. That was her big discovery. And I forget the numbers behind it. If we get another call, you might find it fun to have her share what the actual research showed. But fundamentally, that was that. So when your chemistry isn't in balance, you're going to end up conjuring up all kinds of fantastical stories or imaginings that really aren't happening in reality. And you're also going to start doing other things like acting out or doing things that might be considered careless, irresponsible, etc. And so I think Diane would, while she would say it as a joke, I believe she truly means it. But she thinks that the world would be a much better place if we added SSRIs to the water supply like we add fluoride.
You might have a point there.
The whole world would be better off if it all just took an SSRI. Yeah, there you go. So Boris, to your point, I think things always seem to start with conversation, but in a business setting in particular, that conversation seems to have been preceded by some sort of an event that has now brought an issue to light that we've been asked to now have a conversation around. Now, Boris, because you deal with companies in crisis, it may very well be that crisis in and of itself has an impact on people's neurochemistry, a predictable impact on people's neurochemistry. And so, Brian, it might be interesting for you to say, well, let's say that's okay. And Boris, don't let me tell your story. So Boris deals with companies that are in severe trouble, right? You're coming in and trying to save the day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Right.
Okay. And so I'm just kind of curious, is there a pattern we might be able to identify in what's happening with the executives in a company that is in not just a crisis, but is in the crisis?
Yeah.
So
well, think about what Kathy talks about all the time. We forget that, and I don't remember the guru that said it, but he said businesses don't fail, people do, right? So we forget that the cultural aspect of a business is a living thing, right? Culture is one of the most significant identifiers of the human species. Mm-hmm. Did we not see that through this last era? Yeah. Where I am in terms of this, what is now coined the insurrection capital, right? So you have people who are culturally unidentified or culturally misidentified. You'll see these anomalies in behavior. And again, these are things that in terms of, I forget who wrote the book, The Human Side of Enterprise, that organizations tend to forget. Like you don't have any amount of modeling of that. And there should be. You can model financial statements, you can model all these other aspects of business. But when it comes to the human side in terms of performance, the human side in terms of sustainable behaviors that lead to business growth, no one really knows how to model that. Like this an afterthought, right? Training comes in, oh, we'll delegate some funding for training, afterwards. And that's something that people should have, really taken advantage of, like during the pandemic, because that's something that really becomes a unique advantage for a corporation.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, the challenge that I see oftentimes is right from the top with the key leader, the CEO or the C-suite folks, they're typically type A personalities and hard charging individuals to begin with. And they're not used to getting feedback. They're not used to accepting feedback. And so it sometimes becomes a challenge. And this is where you start to see them act out, and dysfunction kind of comes into the equation. So if you've got a person that had, for example, substance abuse issues or some other issues in their past, they tend to show up in the middle of a crisis. Because they are now under such extreme stress, and they don't have anyone else to turn to, that these behaviors start to come out. So I don't know if it's necessarily a pattern, but I've seen that as very common, just because I think of the type of individual that we're dealing with.
Yeah. And they probably are judging themselves, but instead of them just taking a step back and be like, okay, I am the way I am. And I think Tim talked about this when he's dealing with bias, his work in biases. I am what I am, but I need to understand when the way that I am gets in my own way, and it gets in the way of how I'm conducting business. It starts to infect relationships. That's the emotional regulation part. That's emotional intelligence. Because without that, they're just going to judge themselves. And it's like, instead of being the athlete that understands, okay, yeah, I have all this energy, they're wearing themselves out before the game is even played. They're playing this mind game with themselves, and it's enough to wear anyone out.
Yeah, I think it comes down to not just the emotional intelligence, but the self-awareness of who you are as a human being and how you impact others and relate to others. And if they don't have a good level of maturity around that, they're going to struggle in leading the organization. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, well, and that's where it starts. The emotional intelligence starts with that idea of self-awareness.
Well, and that's why I was thinking, like, even for someone to be willing to hire Boris or one of his consulting team members to help them, they have to be at that point where they are aware enough, or someone with authority is aware enough of what's going on that they're saying, we can't fix this all by our lonesome. Let's pull in, Boris's team and see what we can do there. So at least there's that acknowledgement. I wonder in a large corporation if it's the chairman sees it and the CEO doesn't want to. So who knows what kind of mess you're walking into, but.
So T, I have a question. As we're thinking about these managing states, is it, when do you elicit like the power moves as opposed to just simply upgrade, downgrade, outgrade, ingrid maneuvers?
Yeah, well, I think it depends on what we've been hired to do. So I've often said that, my clients historically do not hire me to help people become more self-actualized, more self-aware, to find spiritual peace, all that stuff that happens at the center of the change grid. I can tell you without having to review my records, I've never been hired to do that, not once in 35 plus years, almost 40 years of doing this kind of work. They always want to hire us to either move their people down and out or up and out. So either they've got people that are, stressed one way or another, and we want to move them down into power, then increase their drive. So we're moving them down grid and out grid. Or the people are being underutilized, underperforming, they're too far down grid, and we need to do something to rebuild their motivation, their engagement, and then again move them out grids, because out grid is where all that stuff we call business actually happens. So that's what they hire us to do. I think that we've had some people, certainly we've certified some people that are more of the spiritual counselors, things like that. They might have a very different client base, but not mine. Mine's all down and out, downgrid maneuvers and outgrid maneuvers put together, or upgrid maneuvers and outgrid maneuvers put together. Yeah. Anybody else? I mean, everyone here has a different practice. So Kathy, you just unmuted. How about you?
Yeah, the thing that I wanted to comment on, and I think that's true. I mean, there are very few places that hire consultants like us to do that kind of, spiritual or getting to the center of the change grid work unless they understand that it's part of the person's growth process that they're trying to develop. But my whole coaching work, and just because of the nature of why it is really about context and, certainly culture, as Brian was saying, that we cannot come in and fix an individual. We can't come in. I almost turn away and have turned away opportunities to try to, when somebody is in such trouble that it's like, come and save this person or we're going to fire them. Yeah. I will turn those down because to me, that's just using, basically saying this individual is the problem. And denying the fact that there is a whole system in place, as has been described, that has actually placed them in a situation where the kind of behavior that they're showing has actually been rewarded up to date, and it has simply become out of control. It has become out of control. So the coaching that I try to, my coaching is all about coaching in context. What is the system that this person is living in and working in? And it starts with what is their personal system, but in addition, what is their organizational cultural system that they're working in, and what is it that they have adapt to that, and what is it that they might be able to do to shift their own behavior, and in the process, even potentially in leadership roles, shift the system. So, it's that kind of systemic look at it, as opposed to a purely psychological, this individual is having a problem, let's fix them, or let's shift their performance.
And maybe that's a great distinction between the work that we do versus the work that a medical or mental health professional would be doing. We really, can't or don't deal with the individual's, I want to say internal, I don't even know how to do the makeup, because we might talk about what their goals are and we might talk about what their struggles have been, but we're more on the practical side of things.
It's all a factor. So you have to factor it all in and understand it to the degree you can, but it's really what difference can they make in terms of their own self-awareness and behavioral change in the context of the system that they're in.
That's right.
Yep. What can you change about their personal psychology, which is not something that I am not in the business.
Yeah, I'm not in the business of doing that either. But just like we talk about the issue is one more at a system kind of level. I think, Boris, as you put your teams together or deploy your teams to help in these situations, are there, or do you have clinicians that get involved in when you really do need to do some work at the individual level?
So we don't per se have clinicians. What we do have is one individual on the team that her extreme focus is on stopping self-sabotage. So if we identify through our program that somebody is self-sabotaging, she can do some work with them to identify their root cause of what they think that might be the issue. And then her process is quite quick and down and dirty. And once she's done with that work, it's up to that individual to take it to the next level. We also have a referral relationship with one individual that treats substance abuse issues that basically, if we identify that that's a problem, we basically say, hey, we're not equipped for this kind of a situation. We need to make a referral. Here's somebody.
Yeah. As opposed to having it under your umbrella.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not something that our team is equipped for, nor we have an interest in getting involved. Yeah. But we make sure that the organizational impacts of what's going on are somehow handled. And we also treat the same situation if we find, like oftentimes crisis situations cause people to do things they wouldn't normally do. And the example would be, financial misdealings with the company's assets and finances, right?
Yep.
So if we identify something in that realm, our protocol is to have a kind of an intervention with the individual and say, look, it is not our place and we cannot be involved in something that may not smell right. So we have an individual who's an attorney that can step into the shoes to protect the interests of the company and the individual. Under the attorney-client privilege, we then cease our engagement. Mm-hmm. And we get hired by that attorney so that at least the work that we're doing is protected under the attorney-client privilege. And then we let the individuals seek the personal help that they need. And then we try to help the organization get through the problems. And, we obviously can't take sides here. Sometimes there is issues, but in our case, in all cases, I should say, we don't deal with public companies. We don't deal with investor groups. What we're dealing with is an individual where it's their own finance. So the financial misdealings usually have a criminal element that could potentially come into play. Right.
Yeah.
So we want to have nothing to do with that.
I couldn't hear.
That makes good sense. I was kind of wondering how you might insulate yourself from that, because when the forensic accountants come along, you definitely want to be either out of the picture altogether or protected in a very specified role.
That's right. As I look at the research on where organizations are going, particularly with designing their own LMS system or some version of it, a learning management system, if you look at any of these managing states on this list right here, they would be interested in all of them. But again, not from that psychological aspect as you just described, but from the, how does this relate to the system, right? Because when we talk about things such as performance, engagement, productivity, any of those things, any of these states on this list here would impact any of them. So they would need to understand systems designed from the perspective of these interconnectedness, like how does it start to impact people? Where can we put people in the best fit in terms of hiring? That's a big thing in today's corporate America. How are we hiring for fit specifically for the organization? And testing that out. But again, if people don't have, organizations don't have ways of modeling that and setting people up for success with like early wins where they'll want more of it because they'll feel successful, they'll feel safe, secure, happy, and healthy in what they're doing. They can measure where they contribute. You can hold them accountable for that contribution to even take it to the next level. These are models. It's a systems thinking thing.
Yep, right. Right. I should get Dave Miller on this call because he's one of the team members we have that actually got certified in systems coaching. I don't know if any of the rest of you have gone through any of that training, but this is very much what he's talking about, but they're applying it to coaching more so than consulting work or something like we've been talking about right now. We have a few minutes left, and I have one last thing I want to talk about anger, but I'm glad that we've naturally migrated onto grief. Next time around, we'll be talking about fear. But let me just throw my little thought out here. It's more of a question. So last time around, we said that there was both passive aggression and open aggression. And we kind of identified that people that were up-grid danger zone and out-grid danger zone are more likely to be very open in whatever the behavior set may be, where people that are very far down-grid and very far in-grid are more likely to be passive-aggressive. And then we talked about, what was a healthy one? Active aggression? Something like, no. Assertive aggression is what we, yeah. And we said that that's kind of an out-grid thing because obviously you want to make something happen, but it's not in the danger zone. And we even described that it was part of the skill set of emotional intelligence. And so this all is resonating very well. Well, someone brought up the question after the fact, and that is that, are we then looking at a possible progression, how someone might move from passive aggressive very far in grid, and then as they move further and further out grid, we start seeing something else. So it's becoming a bit more active in the aggression than passive, or open rather than passive. Then we hit this center spot, and that's where my little puzzle comes into play. And then we get out here where it's more like it's active. What do we call it? No, we call it engaged. No.
Assertive.
Assertive. Thank you so much. I don't know why I just lost that. And then ultimately, if you continue further and further out grid, you ended up in this very problematic kind of an area. And so I thought that's a very interesting. Is there a progression that takes you from being passive to being okay to being in the middle of the change grid? How would you characterize your relationship with anger or situations involving anger or whatever? I mean, anyone want to throw out?
I'd love to throw it here, because the center of the change grid is like the null zone. You know, you're letting go of all the stuff to the left.
Yep.
And you're coming back to zero. You're coming back to detachment. And you have to let go of all of that before you can go into kind of a healthy assertiveness.
Yes.
You know, then you can progress on your own little merry way into the dark side if you choose to. But if you're looking at progression, I don't think it's a clean I mean, the whole point of that center space is to let go of whatever it is you've been emotionally dealing with, so that you can have the clarity of vision and detachment to then make choices.
Right.
Yeah.
And
so there's a sense of neutrality there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, one thing that I said is that to me, I can see a progression if I remove the PowerPoint. So just take it out of the diagram altogether. And I can certainly see how being passively aggressive then moves on to being passive / open, moves to being open / active. That's obviously more engaged there. And ultimately, in its worst possible expression, now it's all just open aggression. So I could do that. And I think I can make my peace with that, because the difference between the PowerPoint being there and not being there is that this idea about detachment. As long as you are actively engaged in whatever the situation is, you might find yourself going through the PowerPoint, but you're not at the PowerPoint, if you will. Because the moment you're at the PowerPoint and doing this PowerPoint kind of work we talk about, now you're separating yourself physically, emotionally, intellectually from whatever's going on. You're becoming the observer of what's going on. And you can apply that to self, certainly, but usually I would say to all of you, our job as human development professionals is to be that observer in that center of the change grid, and then provide whatever insights or guidance are appropriate to us based on what we've observed. But it doesn't help us help anybody if we're out here with them in whatever their aggressive, even if it's assertiveness. It's not my situation to be assertive about. You guys with me? But I might be very well able to coach them through that assertiveness angle of looking at whatever the conflict happens to be.
So it sounds like that's a context shifting of sorts, where like your narrative change. So it's like, I call it ops. When you're going through these experiences, the observer and that which is being observed sometimes is disconnected. So I talk about ops in terms of being an observer and a participant. And then you're closing the gap between the two, right?
Yeah. And Kathy, what were you going to throw in?
Yeah, no, all I was saying was what you were describing there is this, yes, there is the potential for somebody to blow by the PowerPoint, blow it off essentially, and just say, I'm not going to bother with the PowerPoint. I'm just going to take my emotional state and ram it through and keep going.
Moving out grid, right? Yeah. See, my thought is that
get somebody to the PowerPoint then. I mean, that's requires an intervention is what.
That's right. And to me, the center of going to the center of the change grid is a deliberate choice, not an accidental event.
Right.
And so you've chosen, I'm going to go here. And I know that by by definition, you're not doing PowerPoint work until you begin to separate yourself from the moment. Even if it's you're just want to examine your own behavior and your own situation, you will benefit from detaching yourself from it for at least a few moments, and be able to critically observe it from that. So I do kind of, maybe I'm saying that you can be going back and forth, up and down through the PowerPoint all day long and never actually turn it into a PowerPoint experience or a PowerPoint activity. Yeah. Okay.
Wow.
And then the other question that I had is, well, if there is a progression to be explored moving horizontally, and again, if we look at what we're looking at here, this is we either talk about the level of drive is what this horizontal would be, the level of drive, and vertically we're looking at the level of tension. So is there also a progression as I go from being quite passive down here and I start moving up grid a little bit, and now I'm a little bit more active, although not all that much. I'm still quite far down grid. But then I, breeze through the center, and then I end up becoming a little bit more active, less passive, and ultimately it becomes very active. Is there these progressions in the two kinds of anger? And again, we said the anger that we might be focusing on up grid tends to be the result of some external situation going on. So X happened or is happening, where out grid, it tends to be a little bit more, what I want to say, a little longer lasting, a little more long-term, bigger picture. Yeah. So I
more
thought
participatory, because it sounds like if you're progressing upgrade, you're losing more and more control in terms of perception, right? But if you're like out grid, you're participating in something, you're trying to make it happen.
Absolutely.
So you're experimenting.
No, you're stepping into, we say part of the challenge with being in the out-grid danger zone is that the person who lives in the out-grid danger zone creates risk where it doesn't actually exist, purely to make things more interesting.
And that could be tiring. I think I live out there because I always say that I never run out of ideas, but it's quite tiring.
Yeah, and I don't know that you're in the danger zone, but you may very well say, no, I live at 1010. Well, 1010 is on the border. It can be very, number one, fruitful, but it can also be very exhausting.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, because you only have so much. Well, there are certain resources you have finite amounts of, and time on the day is one of them.
Yeah.
Energy in the tanks.
That's even attention. I always say attention is our greatest capital asset, because you can't give attention to everything all at once and be successful. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, that's why I've often wondered if multitasking is just a word that really doesn't describe what's going on.
Right.
So can you actually do two things simultaneously and do them both equally well? Or are you just jumping back and forth between the two with phenomenally rapid switching going on? And as a result, it appears as though you're doing two things at once, but you still have to redirect your attention.
Yeah, there's a real term called attention residue. So they always said that when it's not just you going from one activity, but it's how you transition from one activity to another. And so a lot of times when people are multitasking, it isn't that we can't, but multitasking requires energy, right? And so what tends to happen is you compromise energy on one activity as opposed to the other. And the scientists often say it's the equivalent of channel surfing. Like you're blinking really fast.
Blinking,
so you're not really giving quality the upper hand.
Yep. It's interesting because someone once used the parallel of juggling, because juggling seems like what you're doing is keeping three things in the air all at once. And the truth is, if you actually watch what a juggler is doing, there's only one thing in the air at a time. The other two are in their hand. Yes, one's just arrived and the other is just leaving, but nevertheless, the act of juggling only has one thing in the air simultaneously. I suppose if you can become a very skilled juggler, you can get better at keeping more things in the air. But the truth is that some of them are still in your hands. So Oh, there you go. All right. Well, our time is pretty much up for today. What I would like to do, we started talking a bit about grief today. I'd like to talk on our next call about grief as it applies in business situations. So the kind of situations we actually find ourselves in. Yes, we may deal with someone who's experiencing, personal loss of loved ones and all that. And so I don't want to say we don't get involved in those kinds of things, but we tend to be hired to talk about business-related grief. So the loss of a big contract or the loss of what? And remember, the equation for grief is that there must be some sort of loss accompanied by the belief that I will never have it back again. So loss with the belief that I can have it back is where competition comes into play. That's time to fight. Where there is a loss and I believe, right or wrong, that I can never have it again, that's what the equation is for grief.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
Yep. Okay, so with that, thank you all very much for joining in, and we'll talk again next week. So have a lovely weekend. Bye, everybody.
Okay, thank you. All right.